Eastern France, November 1944. The forests of the Vosges were cold and damp, the air thick with fog and the ghosts of a crumbling Reich. Allied pressure was tightening, sweeping through the hills like a tide that refused to turn back. Roads once held by the Wehrmacht were being swallowed by retreat. Columns of soldiers moved under cover of darkness, the sharp rhythm of boots softened by frostbitten soil. One of those units, an elite intelligence regiment attached to Army Group G, never made it to their checkpoint. More specifically, their commanding officer didn't. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogel, known for his cold precision and ruthless efficiency, simply vanished during the retreat. No calls, no flares, no gunfire. His second-in-command reported that Vogel had entered his command truck near Bruyères just after 2200 hours to review field maps. 20 minutes later, the vehicle was found abandoned. Motor still warm, maps gone, door ajar. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints in the frost, just the outline of a man who had ceased to exist. By dawn, Field HQ had marked him vermissed missing, not captured, not confirmed dead, just absent. The retreat rolled on, but whispers grew. Some claimed Vogel had gone rogue. Others said he'd been targeted by his own for knowing too much. His radio logbook, discovered later near an abandoned field tent, showed one last entry: holding perimeter, awaiting nightfall. Then silence. The Allies pressed forward. Villages were taken, hilltops secured. But Vogel's name remained pinned to every wall in every outpost. No officer of his rank could just disappear, especially not in the final months of war, especially not without a trace. Files were opened, closed, redacted. His personnel records vanished from Berlin's archive 2 weeks later. No obituary, no confirmation, no grave. In the aftermath of war, thousands were listed missing. But Heinrich Vogel's case was different. His name lingered in intelligence reports like a shadow that refused to fade. He was not remembered as dead. He was remembered as unfinished. 4 days after Heinrich Vogel disappeared into the Vosges fog, Allied signal officers intercept a fragmented message during a routine sweep near Colmar. The code was standard Wehrmacht, nothing unusual at first, but the call sign caught someone's attention. It read, Schattenkommando 77, Shadow Command 77. The phrase hadn't appeared in any decrypted communiques since early '44, when it was linked to a now-defunct signals division operating on the Western Front. A ghost unit, long thought dissolved. But the message was fresh. Its coordinates led back to the foothills east of Bruyères, precisely where Vogel vanished. The signal was faint, staticky, as if bouncing between outdated equipment. But its structure was unmistakable. Orders, written in high command phrasing, directing phantom troops to hold Sector Echo and resist Allied movement with discretion. The message ended abruptly, mid-transmission, as though the sender had stopped mid-sentence or been stopped. Allied cryptographers dismissed it as a rogue signal from outdated gear, but others weren't so sure. When the OSS cross-referenced the call sign with German officer profiles, the trail led straight to Vogel. He had used 77 in internal correspondence, a numeric identifier for his private communication channel. There were no records of active units still operating in the area, none that should have been transmitting. But villagers from the outskirts of Gérardmer spoke quietly of something else. In the years after the war, they recalled seeing a single light in the distance on moonless nights, of hearing German radio static on makeshift receivers long after the front had moved on. One farmer claimed his father saw a uniformed man walking the ridge trail weeks after the area had been cleared. He said the man didn't run, he didn't hide, he just stared, nodded once, and vanished into the woods. Locals chalked it up to war nerves. But military records tell a different story. In December of 1944, OSS reports marked a section of the forest as restricted interest. No official explanation followed. Whatever or whoever was transmitting orders under Vogel's code, it wasn't supposed to exist. Yet it did. The war had moved on, but the signal hadn't. Shadow Command 77 was still speaking, and someone, somewhere, was still listening. Just outside Colmar, nestled behind a curtain of poplars and wild grapevines, stood a farmhouse that time had nearly forgotten. Its stone walls bore the cracks of war and weather, ivy climbing like veins up the flaking plaster. To passers-by, it was just another relic of rural France, abandoned, weather-worn, and silent. But the villagers who lived nearby remembered differently. During the occupation, it had been commandeered by the Wehrmacht, though not as a barracks or outpost. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't visible from the road. Yet German troops came and went at strange hours, often under the cover of night. Local resistance fighters watched from the hills and took notes. There were no flags, no insignias, only armed men unloading crates from covered trucks, then vanishing inside. No one knew what was being stored, or why guards rotated so often. One night in early 1944, a fire was spotted near the east field. Flames briefly illuminated figures moving in a line behind the barn, carrying something long and wrapped. By morning, there was nothing but ash and boot prints. The resistance debated action, but before they could strike, the Germans were gone. As suddenly as they had come, the farmhouse was empty again. The war ended, people returned, but the farmhouse remained a place of unease. Families who tried to settle there didn't stay long. Stories grew about lights flickering in rooms with no wiring, the sound of boots in the attic, even voices heard through heating vents that no longer worked. One owner, a retired schoolteacher, stayed 6 months before fleeing without explanation. He left behind his books, his dishes, and a note with only 3 words. They never left. The property changed hands over the decades, sold cheap, inherited, forgotten. The paint peeled, the roof sagged. Weeds overtook the barn. But the cellar remained locked, its door fused with rust, the key long lost. Locals didn't go near it. Children dared each other to knock and run. No one stayed long enough to listen for a knockback. It wasn't haunted in the ghost story sense. It was haunted by memory, by something colder than spirits. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening. In the spring of 2022, a man named Luc Armand returned to the farmhouse with a plan. He wasn't superstitious. He was a structural engineer from Lyon, and the house had been in his family for generations, passed from uncle to nephew, skipped over like a stone across water. He wanted to restore it. Not for profit, but for history, for closure. Luc had heard the stories, of course. The rumors of Germans hiding in the cellar, the mysterious footsteps, the voices, but he chalked it up to post-war trauma and too many late-night drinks. The renovations began slowly clearing brush, replacing windows, gutting the ruined kitchen. Then came the cellar. The iron door had rusted shut decades ago, but Luc pried it loose with a crowbar and a curse. The room beneath was as expected: stone walls, rotted beams, empty shelves, and a floor of hard-packed dirt. But the dimensions didn't line up. Luc noticed the room was smaller than the foundation plans showed, a discrepancy of 2 meters. Curious, he began digging near the rear wall, where the earth looked subtly disturbed. His shovel struck something metallic. He cleared more. A panel, square, bolted shut. He tapped it. It echoed differently than the surrounding stone. When he pried it open, the floor gave way slightly, revealing a void beneath. Dust rose into the air, thick and bitter, like paper and rust. Beneath the panel, a hatch, iron, rusted but intact. The kind used in military field bunkers, the kind not found on any civilian blueprint. Luc hesitated. It wasn't just the air, it was the weight of something unspoken pressing in on him. He found a flashlight, forced the hatch open, and stared down into a hole cut into the bedrock. A stairwell, narrow and steep, led into blackness. Stone walls choked with cobwebs, wooden steps swollen with age. No sound came from below, just a dense, waiting silence. The kind of silence that had shape, that had memory. Luke called out once. No echo, no reply. He descended slowly, unaware that he was the first person in 78 years to set foot inside a room history had tried to forget. And what waited at the bottom had never left. The first descent wasn't left to Luke alone. Within 48 hours, the cellar was swarming with investigators, archaeologists from Strasbourg, local gendarmes, and a historian from the Regional War Museum who arrived before dawn with a briefcase and a look that said he already suspected something terrible. Floodlights were brought in, masks distributed. The hatch groaned open again, and together they stepped into the earth's throat. The stairwell sank deeper than anyone expected. 15 steps, then a landing, then another flight carved directly into bedrock. The air was cold enough to bite, not stale, but preserved, as if whatever was down here hadn't dared to breathe for decades. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber roughly the size of a single-room shelter, and it was intact. Perfectly, impossibly intact. A World War II-era field bunker sealed from time and sunlight. Against the left wall stood a bench crowded with rusted radio equipment, headsets, transmitters, coils of wire arranged with obsessive care. A map table dominated the center, littered with yellowing documents pinned under brass weights. Rations sat stacked on shelves, tins of bread, beans, and powdered milk, some unopened. Their labels faded to ghosts of German text. But the far corner held the first real revelation, a bunk, neatly made despite the rot. On it lay a folded Wehrmacht officer's uniform, the insignia dull with age. Beneath it, a name tag stitched in precise thread, H. Vogel. A pair of ID tags hung from a nail, like someone had planned to retrieve them, or had been too weak to. Then someone screamed. The flashlight beam had caught something half hidden in the shadows. Boots, officer boots, still laced, still upright. Attached to them, slumped against the stone wall, was a skeletal body draped in the remnants of a greatcoat. The skull tilted downward, frozen in a posture of exhaustion or despair, hands curled on the floor as if they'd reached for something, anything in the final moments. Dust clung to the bones like ash. Archaeologists stepped closer, their breaths shallow. No signs of violence, no bullet holes, no shattered bone. Just a man who had stayed, too long, too deep, too loyal to abandon whatever mission had trapped him in this bunker he'd built or taken. One thing was certain now. Heinrich Vogel had not disappeared into the fog of 1944. He had gone underground, and he had died here, alone, waiting for orders that would never come. On the map table lay the truth Vogel had never meant anyone to find. Stacks of brittle papers, each one meticulously written in tight, controlled handwriting. Among them, his personal war diary, its leather cover cracked, its spine stiff with age. When the historians opened it, the ink inside was shockingly clear, as if preserved by the bunker's dry, unmoving air. Entries detailed troop movements, intercepted Allied reports, and coded directives addressed to a mysterious entity labeled only as 77. The handwriting grew jagged toward the final pages, as if the writer had been trembling or deteriorating. But the most disturbing discoveries weren't in the diary. They were in the sealed envelopes tucked neatly inside a drawer of the desk. Orders. Signed not by Heinrich Vogel, but by someone named H. Werner, a known alias, one tied to Black Ops logistics units that had never officially existed. The orders called for continued resistance, independent of command structure, and demanded that unspecified operatives maintain radio silence except for code 77 transmissions. There were maps, too, hand-drawn, pinned with string and marked with symbols that didn't match any known Wehrmacht cartography. Circles around now liberated villages, triangles marking ridgelines, an unsettling cluster of X's near Colmar, dated December 1944, weeks after Vogel's documented disappearance. Weeks after he was supposedly gone. Weeks after his unit had retreated miles from this region. The implication struck everyone at once. Vogel hadn't vanished. He hadn't deserted. He had relocated underground, literally beneath a farmhouse, operating a one-man command post long after the war had swallowed everything above him. He had continued issuing orders, continued sending radio signals, continued believing he was holding a line no one else could see. One archaeologist whispered the thought none of them wanted spoken aloud. He thought the war wasn't over. The historian frowned. No, he said quietly. He thought his war wasn't over. As they sifted through the documents, a darker layer emerged. Revision notes, falsified troop reports, and operational plans that referenced units already destroyed. It was as if Vogel had rewritten the battlefield inside his mind, reshaping reality to justify staying hidden, to justify fighting alone. The dates proved it beyond doubt. Vogel kept transmitting instructions for nearly a month after the area fell. Orders sent into the void. Orders received by no one. Orders issued by a man slowly severing ties with the world above. The bunker hadn't just preserved a body. It had preserved a delusion, a war fought in silence, a commander who refused to surrender not to the Allies, not to time, not even to death. They found it tucked beneath the cot, sealed in an oilskin envelope, preserved as if Vogel had known someone someday would open it. A final transmission, handwritten in a sharp, feverish script that cut into the paper like a blade. The encryption was standard Wehrmacht ciphering at first, but halfway through it shifted into a strange hybrid of shorthand notes and Vogel's personal symbols. It took 2 days and a small team of cryptographers to break. When they did, the room fell into a silence heavier than the bunker's stale air. The message was never sent. The radio beside the desk had died weeks before the man using it had. Yet Vogel had composed this as if an entire division still awaited his word. Hold the line until the new order returns. Maintain position. Resist dissolution. Trust no reports from outside command. The phrasing was rigid, militaristic, but cracked at the edges like a mind caught between duty and delirium. Lines were crossed out, rewritten, circled furiously. In some paragraphs he referred to himself in the third person, as if reviewing his own orders from a higher authority. In others, he warned of false victory narratives and premature withdrawals orchestrated by traitors. One section chilled the team more than the rest. Vogel had drafted a list of commands addressed to units that no longer existed. Entire battalions wiped out months earlier appeared here as if waiting patiently outside his bunker walls. He emphasized secrecy, absolute silence. "They will tell you the war is lost," he wrote. "Believe nothing. Only fortresses endure." The historian who'd studied his diary recognized the spiral immediately. Vogel hadn't simply stayed behind. He had built a private front line inside his mind, a self-contained battlefield where surrender didn't exist. Duty had transformed into obsession. Reality had folded under the weight of isolation. His final directive wasn't a military order, it was a manifesto of a man trying to command shadows. When they finished reading, no one spoke. The archaeologist placed the letter beside the uniform on the cot. It lay there like a last breath, finally released. A testament not to loyalty, but to the terrifying momentum of a mind that refused to accept the world had moved on without it. To understand how a decorated officer ended up dying in a dirt-walled bunker beneath a French farmhouse, investigators turned to the archives in Berlin. What emerged was a portrait of a man who began his military career with brilliance and promise. Heinrich Vogel, born in 1,908 inches, Leipzig, was a textbook prodigy. Fluent in 3 languages, trained in engineering, and graduated top of his class at the War Academy. By 1940, he was already commanding specialized intelligence units. His evaluations described him as calm under pressure, scientifically minded, and exceptionally strategic. His superiors praised his precision. His subordinates feared his discipline. But something shifted as the war turned against Germany. Reports from late 1943 hinted at tension conflicts with other officers, arguments over retreat strategies, a growing disdain for what he called cowardly withdrawals. By the spring of 1944, Vogel had begun drafting independent defensive plans without approval, constructing elaborate diagrams of fortress networks. Small, self-sustaining pockets meant to resist Allied advances indefinitely. His superiors dismissed the plans as impractical, even delusional. The real break came in September 1944. Several accounts describe him refusing a direct order to pull back from a compromised sector, insisting his unit could hold if the outer world stopped capitulating. Witnesses later recalled his eyes wide, sleepless, convinced he saw a path to victory no one else understood. After a formal reprimand, Vogel became increasingly isolated, spending hours hunched over maps, rewriting battlefield lines as if he could will them back into formation. Soldiers whispered that he no longer trusted other officers, that he believed only he saw the war clearly. One psychiatrist reviewing his file decades later suggested he may have suffered a psychological collapse under the strain of defeat paranoia, fed by ideology, fueled by pride, and sealed by isolation. Another argued he'd become fanatically loyal to a collapsing dream, unable to accept a world in which Germany could lose. Whatever the cause, by November 1944, Heinrich Vogel was no longer the rising star. He was a man standing alone against the tide of history, convinced the war wasn't ending, it was being betrayed. And when the retreat swept past him, when the lines broke, when the world outside his maps collapsed, Vogel did what only a man trapped inside his own conviction would do. He built a fortress. He descended into it. And he never came back. What Vogel built beneath the farmhouse wasn't just a bunker. It was a kingdom of one, a fortified delusion sealed in concrete and silence. Forensic teams and military historians spent weeks reconstructing the 78 days he likely spent underground, using log entries, ration records, and the slow decay of the objects he left behind. The timeline was grimly precise. The earliest diary entry after his disappearance was dated November 11, 1944. In it, he noted the arrival at Post Echo, a name never before seen in Wehrmacht field designations. He documented inventory, food stores, ammunition, functioning radio components, and outlined a daily protocol. 3 meals, twice daily radio transmissions, map review at 1,800 hours. Discipline, even in isolation, especially in isolation. He had enough rations for 3 months, if stretched. He did stretch them. Each tin was notched with a date, each water flask logged and measured. The man who had once commanded field units now measured salt by the gram and scribbled imaginary troop movements on aging maps. He issued command directives to absent units, coordinated phantom reinforcements, even marked weather patterns as if planning air support that would never come. The most haunting artifact wasn't a weapon or a map, it was a notebook labeled Rückkehr Return. Inside were letters never sent, reports never read. In the final pages, the writing frayed. Words trailed off. Lines repeated. The last entry was just 3 words, still holding position. There were no signs he ever tried to leave, no handprints on the hatch, no disturbed dust near the exit. He had chosen to remain, day after day, waiting. For what? A counterattack? A command to re-emerge? The return of a Reich already in ashes? He had built himself a prison, disguised as a command post, a single chair, a single voice. No enemy to fight, no orders to follow, only the static of a world that had already left him behind. Vogel died surrounded by radios tuned to silence, maps redrawn into madness, and the quiet echo of a war that ended without him. In the end, he didn't fall in battle or defect. He buried himself. The disappearance had always been too clean. No witnesses, no wreckage, a high-ranking officer vanishing on retreat with no trace. It didn't make sense until it did. As the investigation deepened, a new theory took shape. Vogel hadn't disappeared. He had planned an escape not from the enemy, but from his own command. Evidence pointed to premeditation. The bunker wasn't slapped together during a retreat. It was engineered, reinforced concrete, ventilation shafts, drainage systems. It was a field fortress, not a panic hole. Blueprints didn't exist in military records, but local villagers remembered something. Back in the summer of 1943, German troops had requisitioned labor from nearby farms. They claimed to be digging fuel storage or weapons caches. Locals weren't allowed near. One man, then just a boy, recalled trucks arriving late at night, materials covered in tarps, crates marked with black eagles. Post-war aerial surveys showed subtle shifts in the terrain behind the farmhouse flattened soil that matched the bunker's footprint. The construction wasn't rushed. It was planned. Vogel had seen something coming. Whether it was military collapse or ideological betrayal, he believed a moment would arrive when he could no longer follow orders because the orders would be wrong. His solution wasn't defection, it was detachment. Go underground, stay hidden, command from the shadows until Germany was reborn. One recovered memo unsigned, but clearly his read, "If the body is defeated, the mind must survive. We are the mind now." Delusional? Possibly, but not stupid. He left no paper trail, used an alias for the false orders, kept transmissions coded and fragmented. He even burned some of his own field records. Ashes were found in a ventilation grate, along with scraps of official Wehrmacht stationery. But there was one detail that sealed it: a small lockbox near the bunk containing a second pair of ID tags. Not his. They belonged to another officer, likely dead, possibly planted. A body to be found, while Vogel went into the earth. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. A final, desperate belief that from beneath the rubble, the Reich could be reborn through whispers, orders, silence. Vogel didn't go missing. He went operational, and the war, at least in his mind, had never ended. The story broke across Europe like a bombshell detonated decades late. Nazi officer found in hidden bunker 78 years later. The headline made front pages in Berlin, Paris, London. News crews swarmed the sleepy countryside outside Colmar, cameras catching aerial shots of the farmhouse as police stood guard over what was now a crime scene from another century. In France, the discovery reopened wounds most thought had finally scarred over. Families of resistance fighters, some of whom had vanished during the occupation, came forward, voices trembling as they recalled the name Heinrich Vogel. To some, he had been a ghost story. A cold officer who oversaw interrogations, who left villages in silence after marching through with black-gloved precision. One woman, now in her 90 seconds, told reporters, "My brother was taken. We always heard it was him. I never believed he left." In Germany, the reaction was more fractured. Historians debated whether Vogel's actions were proof of fanaticism or a deeper psychological fracture. Some labeled him a dangerous ideologue who clung to a lost cause in delusion and defiance. Others argued he was a relic of a dying regime, crushed by the weight of his own doctrine. A few voices, disturbingly fringe, called him loyal to the end, a symbol of unbroken resolve. Those voices did not go unchallenged. Survivors, scholars, and war veterans stepped forward to denounce any attempt to martyr him. "He wasn't a commander," said one historian on live television. "He was a coward with a radio and a fantasy. His silence wasn't noble, it was pathological." Still, questions lingered. How many others like Vogel had slipped through the cracks of history? How many bunkers lay buried beneath Europe's quiet villages, their occupants long dead but their intentions still pulsing in walls of stone? The farmhouse became a flashpoint, a site of pilgrimage, protest, and reflection. In the public consciousness, Vogel was no longer a man. He was a warning, a reminder of how ideology can bury itself not only in policy and propaganda, but in basements, in minds, in the false security of concrete and belief. The war had ended in 1945, but for one man, it had never stopped. And now, the world had to reckon with the echo he left behind. 78 years after Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogel vanished into the fog of eastern France, the war he refused to surrender to finally surfaced beneath a farmhouse, behind a hatch, in a chamber where time held its breath. The bunker has since been sealed under reinforced glass, preserved as it was found. Visitors stand in silence above the descent, peering into the dim geometry of stone and rust. The desk, the cot, the folded uniform, the boots still planted where death found him. Nothing moved. Nothing dared to. A plaque was installed by the regional government not to honor, but to remember. It bears no photograph, no rank, no medals. Just a single sentence. Here, a man waited for a war that had already ended. Tourists arrive in quiet trickles. School groups are brought by teachers who speak in low tones. Survivors leave notes, some bitter, some broken. The moral isn't clean. It never is. Vogel was a monster to some, a mystery to others. But the legacy he left isn't about him. It's about what can fester in silence. About how belief can harden into delusion, and delusion into doctrine, and doctrine into death beneath the floorboards of history. His bunker is now part memorial, part warning. A museum of unresolved conviction. The radios remain lifeless. The maps still show a war that never played out. The last directive sits behind glass, its ink fading slowly. Hold the line until the new order returns. It never did. What Vogel built was not a fortress, it was a tomb, a monument to the danger of isolation, of ideology unchecked, of silence mistaken for survival. And in uncovering it, the world is reminded of a truth it tries to forget, that history doesn't sleep, it waits. Sometimes beneath rubble, sometimes beneath land deeds, sometimes beneath the fragile belief that the past can be buried and left alone. But what is buried isn't always forgotten. Not when there are still bones in the ground. Not when the war is still whispering beneath the floorboards. They say he was never found. But the truth is far simpler. He was never missing. He was waiting. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.